true mastery doesn't seem masterful. When I got that, it's like you become common and rugged as a stone, but yet people that are into that conversation, they see your light, they see your brilliance.
You know, when I started this podcast, I really thought that I would super niche down and focus on just having conversations with other entertainment hypnotists. I still think that's what I'll do most of the time. But already, just within the space of doing a few episodes, I came to realize that there are certainly perspectives that can be offered by people who don't perform as hypnotists that might help us enrich what we do. And my guest for this episode is the perfect example of that. John Launius is a C-suite executive of 3 companies. He's an author, he's a consultant, he's a historian, he's a speaker. None of those things are why he's here for this episode. I asked him to come and talk with me because he is a hypnotist, and he is also a pretty rare individual in that he has a level of expertise few people have in the art of kodo, which is the Japanese art of fragrance. He studied and continues to study and be a master of an art form that's over 1,000 years old. And we're going to bridge that to the work that stage hypnotists do. We actually are. And I think if you stick with this and follow it all the way through, you'll be really glad you did.
When I was 9 years old, I started studying two things, martial arts and world fragrance traditions. And how this happened was that, I was getting bullied because my brother is a person with a disability, and I would oftentimes try to protect him. And all that did was get me beat up. And so my mother said, let's send him to martial arts class. And so I got sent to martial arts class, and all that did was get me beat up more, but that's okay. Out of that, I would meet, some very well-known martial artists, and I would actually warm incense for them in the years to follow. But Mr. Black, my first martial arts teacher in Taekwondo, so I've done Taekwondo, Shotokan, Judo, Yakushin Kagyu, and then over 30 years of Aikido. And I'm talking hard, soft style, not like, just energy. I'm talking like real street effective Aikido. Anyway, Mr. Black was burning what I would call bad incense. And so I was curious about it. Like, what's this thing that's like it's a stick and there's this smoke and there's fragrance? This is cool. I've never seen this before. So I took some and I didn't tell my mom, and I went home, and I'm burning it in my room, and all of a sudden from across the house you could hear my mother running across and kicking the door. What are you doing? I'm burning incense. She said, you can't do that. I'm like, what do you mean I can't do that? She said, no. You can do that, but you got to let me know so you don't burn the house down. And I was like, okay. She goes, you got that from martial arts class? I said, yes. And she said, well, do you like it? I said, yes. And so she gave me a book on world religions. And I said, why are you giving me a book on world religions? And she said, John, because every culture and every religion has had incense from the beginning. My mother was a hippie, and my father was a military man. So if you spend any amount of time with me, I am the perfect amalgamation of the two of those individuals. So if you want to talk woo woo, we can talk woo woo all day long. If you want to talk science and you want to talk chemistry and you want to talk history, I'm more than happy to do that as well. And I think we all do that to a certain extent, just based on kind of where we get involved in different subjects. But so from the ages of 9 to 13, I studied on my own. I was just fascinated by the subject because, just real quick before I tell the next piece of this, the written history of incense is 6,000 years old. The archaeological evidence of incense is 35,000 years old. And where that comes from are the caves in southern France. There's a cave called Bear Skull Cave. Can you imagine, Paul, that there's lots of bear skulls? Well, you're right. And so one of them was turned upside down and put on a raised rock as if some kind of a devotional process, and then went outside and grabbed some pine needles and then put it in there and lit it on fire. And so after that would extinguish out, then it wouldn't be touched again for 35,000 years. And so somewhere along the way, one of our ancestors did something devotional. And so we know from all of the writings that we've been able to get access to that when incense burns, obviously there's smoking incense and there's non-smoking incense, and we may make that distinction as we go along. But when you're watching smoking incense and you're watching the smoke rise up, really two things are happening. Number one, the smoke almost becomes like water. And there's a piece of our brain that needs to see water that relaxes us. And so it becomes in many ways a discursive meditation. Obviously, there's fixed meditation and there's discursive meditation. I mean, movement in that, right? So martial arts can be a discursive, meditation. Golf can be that. So you can find your way in that without, again, it necessarily having to be woo-woo or the association of that. But the real use of incense, we know, happens shortly after the advent of fire. So our current iteration of human beings that we're called Homo sapiens sapiens. And they keep pushing back the number. Right now, we're at about 300,000 years, okay? So we have been the same level of ability and intelligence for 300,000 years. And so someone, 300,000 years ago, or maybe before that, when we discovered fire, threw something fragrant on the fire and said, "Hey, wow, I feel better. My sinuses opened up." I'm sure they didn't use that language, but you get where I'm going with this, right? And then the group that may have felt that said, "Well, we need to put somebody in charge of that. Let's see, maybe we'll put you in charge of it and we'll call you a shaman," right? And then so there's a lot of connotations with shamanism in this world, and shamanism can be the person responsible for the balance between the physical world and the spiritual world. And so as you get deeper and deeper into the subject, you see a lot of connections, to actually deeply connecting to the natural world. When I was 13 years old, I would meet my first teacher of incense. And she was a qualified, rated, and trained Komoto. So what does that mean? Well, in the Japanese tradition of incense, which is about 1,400 years old, she had trained officially to become a Komoto. And a Komoto is the equivalent of a tea master for the Japanese incense ceremony. And so we are trained in all of the accoutrements of the Japanese incense ceremony, understanding the games of the incense ceremony. This is called the monkoro. And the monkoro is the incense listening vessel. So do you kind of see the mountain there at the top?
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, believe it or not, that's all pressed ash at the top.
Come on.
Yeah, so that's pressed ash. And so what we do in the traditional Japanese incense ceremony is that we cover with one hand, we inhale, and then we turn our head. Now, this gets into the art that I will do traditional Japanese incense ceremonies, but still today, but it takes about 4 to 6 hours and it's a significant investment, long story
Wow.
short. But what's important about this, I'm going to put this away. What's important about the Monkoro is that it's this whole idea of listening to incense, which sounds a little non sequitur at first, right? Or nonsensical. But it comes from an ancient Buddhist sutra, and it's okay if you're not Buddhist, just stay with me. It talks about how in the Buddha's world, everything is fragrant like incense. And so when we're listening to a fragrance, we're listening for the enlightenment or we're listening for the benefit. I'm going to make a lot of juxtapositions here. So if you live in a state now where you have legal cannabis, you might have, if you enjoy cannabis, you might have gone into a dispensary and, one of the bud tenders says, "Here, smell this." Your nose knows because your nose does know. Your nose is such an incredible tool for the rest of your body. And what they're asking you to do essentially is smell the terpenes. There's about 40 to 50,000 terpenes in the natural world that control the color, the taste, and the smell of everything in the natural world. And so your body will know what it needs to know. And so back to the story at 13 years old. So I meet this Japanese Komoto. She has a conversation with my mother, where some kids go to piano class, I would go to incense class. And so for a decade, I trained in all the distinctions of Kodo, do meaning the way, ko meaning incense, so the way of fragrance. There's a lot of association with the tea ceremony. The two gentlemen who were primarily responsible for beginning the incense schools were also tea masters. And so there's a lot of crossover. But when the fall of the Tokugawa happens in essentially 1867 and the Meiji Restoration begins, i.e., the modernization of Japan, you saw a big shift between many of the arts. And so this is when the art of incense and the art of tea begins to separate, even though they're the one incense that connects them both, pretty high level is an incense called neriko. And neriko are little black balls that are put together that the same technology we can trace all the way back to Egypt. And so over time, with things like the Library of Alexandria and other major libraries that don't get as much attention as the Library of Alexandria, we know that a lot of this information has been being shared, for thousands of years. You may have heard of the Silk Road. Well, originally the Silk Road was known as the Spice Road, and even before that, it was known as the Incense Road. And so these trails and bringing this medicine, because that's really what it is, all around the world, so there are deep connections. And so, again, from the ages of 13 to 23, I trained officially as a Komoto. At the age of 23, I achieved the rank of a Komoto, and then I began lecturing internationally on the subject. One of the first things that I was invited to do was to lecture at the Shoedo Corporation, which is the oldest Japanese incense company operating in America. They've been open since 1705, so they've been around for a minute. And even though we can trace them a lot, I mean, earlier than that, because they might be preparing the incense inside of the temples, or inside of the capital. But the point is that I was one of the first non-Japanese to lecture, and then that would open up doors to meet some luminaries, like really big martial artists, people like Steven Seagal and other people like that, where I'd be traveling around the world. There's a pretty famous photo out on the internet of me sitting with Steven Seagal and Soga Rinpoche as a very young 23-year-old Komoto burning incense, warming incense at the Ritz in Paris. So that's out there. But I've discussed incense with people like Ryan Holiday of Daily Stoic fame, Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, when he and I worked together on an event a number of years ago.
So there's two things I want you to think about at this point in the podcast. First, I hope you get a sense of John's bona fides and you recognize that this is a man who's seriously devoted to his craft, has had some pretty interesting life experiences, and has something to offer you. The other thing that may not come to you as quickly, but did for me, and I want to plant this seed with you, is as you hear him talk about what he talked about in this first section and what he continues to talk about from this point forward, really think about what does it mean to achieve the level of knowledge and skill and mastery that this man has achieved. That's the part that made me want to talk to him so much initially. If we want to be better at our craft and we want to really achieve mastery, how do we go about that? What does it really take to make that happen? And why haven't we yet? Why are some people like John able to do what they do and maybe we don't find our way to that as easily? What's that about? Is that something you want to explore more and go after more? That's one of the big things that for me was a reason for making this entire episode, and that I continue to think about this conversation that I had with him, and I hope you will too.
But how does it relate to hypnotism, right? It relates to hypnotism in a whole number of ways. Number one, when you are in the presence of a natural fragrance and you enjoy the fragrance, what happens, Paul? You and I can do a little work together.
Well, I can tell you from my direct experience with you, it was profound to me that, your first thing, I think normally when you pick up any fragrance is you just awareness, right? You just go, oh, something's different. I notice this. But when I was with you that day, some of it I could barely notice.
Mm.
And yet I felt my inner sense of self change. And that was so fascinating to me. I felt myself come down, and I wasn't like stressed or anything. It was like 9 a.m. but I felt everything come down, And I felt this sort of change. And I think, to go back to your actual question, my other times in life where I've had that naturally would be like peeling open an orange, and it's sort of
Mhm.
the opposite, right? You get this beautiful spritz of zest, and you pick up. But
Mhm.
there's a recognition that, if I pull a pickle out of a jar and just get vinegar, right, and some dill, that
Right.
there are this, yeah, it's, you shift, I guess, is like there's an immediate, like there's an awareness and then some kind of a shift. There's an emotional response. Am I
Yeah.
like, is, yeah, okay, that's
Yes.
enough for
So,
me.
so that's no, that's perfect. No, that's perfect. I mean, you just gave us a great deal of information that we can now codify and put into the conversation. So our sense of smell is the only sense that does not go through the thalamus. So one part of the limbic system. Every other sense that we have is filtered, meaning it goes through the thalamus. How smelling salts work is that I crack open a smelling salt, I put it underneath your nose, and then you react to it before you think about it. That's because our sense of smell skips the thalamus and goes right to the rhinocephalin. The rhinocephalin is the oldest part of our brain, and it is deeply connected to our emotions and our feelings and our fight and flight and rest mechanism. And so freeze, fight, flight, and freeze. So when you smell a fragrance that is relaxing and enjoyable to you, what happens is that you move very quickly into rest and digest. You're like, oh, I love how that smells. When you just mentioned the orange and opening that up, what you're probably getting access to is, on one level, is a terpene called limonene. What do you think limonene smells like, Paul?
I'm gonna guess lemons.
Oh my gosh, there we
I'm good
go.
at this, aren't I?
Paul is on the board for $200. Congratulations, right? So limonene is one of the terpenes of the 40,000. Now, of the 40,000, there's like what I would call the greatest hits. So there's like probably between 35 and 50 that show up really all over the place. Let's play the game again, Paul. Are you ready?
Yeah.
There's another terpene called apinene. What do you think apinene smells like?
I'm gonna guess it smells like pine trees.
Oh my gosh, ladies and gentlemen, he's on the board again.
Two
Oh my
for
God,
two.
super two, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. So pinene is a fragrance that you'll find in frankincense. You'll find it in copal. You'll find it in actual pine resin. Well, the word pineal, the root word is pine, and it also looks like a pine cone. So if you ever want to excite your pineal gland, you don't, I mean, look, go to the seminar if you want to go to the seminar, but really all you need is a little bit of pine resin or any of the other fragrances that have pinene in it, and then your mind is open and active and moving. Now, this is what I mean earlier of talking about the difference between the woo-woo part, right, and the science and the history and the chemistry. Well, even if you don't believe in the chakras, from a scientific standpoint, this is where our nerves come together very powerfully. And so the word chakra, which most of you know, it means wheel. And so sometimes when we're dealing with people, especially our clients as hypnotists, they're locked, their emotional state may be blocked because of some limiting thought or memory. And so even if you don't want to get into this at the level that me and many others have studied for many years, is that even if in your hypnosis office or room, if you've got a little bit of sandalwood or a little bit of pure frankincense that's just warming, not burning, warming, and just the fragrance is filling the room, you'll have people come in and go, oh, wow, that smells really good. Well, the second you say it smells really good, I've already got you halfway to your induction.
When I did my clinical training, my instructors were adamant that you make your clinical space as neutral as possible,
Mhm.
because they said what one person enjoys as a smell, another person may not.
Mhm.
And then you're making the process of building rapport so much trickier.
Mhm.
And so I'm like, what? But like what you're telling me, I'm like, why shouldn't we be making the room smell nice? And I'm thinking, I never ever even began to think about what if I made an entire theater smell nice.
Mhm.
So I guess that's my, if you were doing a entertainment hypnosis event
Mhm.
and you wanted to use a smell, and especially I work in the college market,
Right.
and college students have the highest levels of anxiety ever, right? There's
Yeah.
more anxious young people on college campuses than ever. And it
Mhm.
does affect, I don't get as many volunteers as I used to. So if I could show myself somehow that taking a step like adding fragrance to the room actually got me more people on stage and we all had more fun, that would be huge. What are your thoughts about that?
In the 1980s, the Japanese were really the country that really pioneered this. Have you been to Vegas much?
Yeah, I've been quite a few times. Yeah.
Okay, so did you know that almost every major Vegas hotel slash casino has its own unique signature smell?
I did not know that.
So when you walk into Caesars, they're pumping this fragrance through, right? There are some companies in Japan, especially, that will pump some kind of a lemon-esque fragrance through their entire building because lemon, like you said earlier, like the orange, wakes you up. So every casino, not every, but most of the big casinos will have their own signature scent. So you spend, a week at Caesars or some other, big casino, and then you go back home wherever you are, and then you happen to come across a fragrance that's very similar to that, you're going to remember Caesars. You're going to remember the Sahara. Because here's the thing. When you walk into somebody's home that you've never been in before, how long do you quote unquote smell the smell of their house?
You notice it right away that it's different than your home, but
Right.
I would think that only lasts for like maybe like 15 seconds. I feel like it goes really fast.
Yeah, yeah. So it can be anywhere between 30 seconds to a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So long as you're not introducing any other fragrances, like if they're cooking dinner or things like that. What happens is that your scent bulb, your olfactory system, all the receptors get used up. And so then you stop thinking about that. So the way our senses work is that if something doesn't change, we stop paying attention to it. And so I'm going to be a little dramatic. If you're walking into somebody's house and you smell their house and then all of a sudden you don't smell it anymore, well, you've been doing this your entire life. Every environment that you have gone through your entire life, you have smelled that environment, assuming that your sense of smell works the way that it's designed to do. And even if not, the chemicals or like the essence of the fragrances that are in the air still get into your system. You may not perceive them, but they're there. And so what I'll do is in my intake is that I'll start to figure out, first of all, what kind of a fragrance person are you? It's like a lot of the fragrances I use, most North Americans or Canadians have not smelled these things because they're exotic fragrances. They're places from around the world. So the benefit is on one level, they don't have an emotional connection to that. Where if I brought you a McDonald's hamburger, who knows, what associations you would have. But when you walk into a McDonald's, if you still eat that food, I don't. But if you walk into a McDonald's, McDonald's pretty much smells that way all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I walk into a McDonald's, again, I haven't done this in a while, but I go right back to when I was 11 years old skateboarding because me and my 11-year-old friends, we would go to McDonald's and get we could afford like an orange juice, and so when you go in there, I go right back to that. But that was a happy time for me. So the smell of McDonald's would access a particular emotion for me that is a happy time. And so what's interesting about memory, and obviously we talked earlier about the limbic system and our connection to memory. Our memory is a wonderful thing. It tells us who we are, but it also tells us who we are. And so if you're someone who's about growth and expansion, hence there's an expression from the Tao that says the path forward seems to go back. And so when we are looking at transforming ourselves or changing, we have to go back. We have to access that memory, that piece of us that tells us, okay, you know what? I can't do that because when I was 12 years old, I failed at it. Or I can't do that at age 40 because when I was 27, I failed at it. And you get that imprint, this connection between memories and thoughts and emotions and how fragrance we can access that. But in the incense world, anything's fragrant can become a tool for you. And so when I was first doing this 30 years ago, there seemed to be a little bit of like resistance from the aromatherapist, like as if to say, oh, this is incongruent, when not at all. I will use oils just as much as I use incense, depending on what I'm looking to do. So, for example, because rose oil has to be so concentrated, like rosata, for example. So if somebody wants to kind of really emotionally open up, rose oil is amazing. But there's no amount of petals that I can take and put onto a warmer to create the same amazing effect as using a pure rose oil impact. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, look, I've been studying oils for 30 years, what John does doesn't relate to me. It absolutely does. There's been a ton of people that see the possibility of opening, things up that way. In the same way that, if you're Christian, I'll just tell a quick story from the Bible. If you're Christian, you may have heard the story of Mary anointing the feet of Jesus. Have you heard that before?
Yes.
Okay. So most of the time people leave out the other part of it. So the full and exact quote or the essence of it is this: Mary anointed the feet of Jesus with oil of spikenard, very costly. So most people have never smelled what spikenard is. And so when I'm addressing Christian audiences, for example, and I'll explain the religion here in a minute because I think that's important too. But when you are using the oil, right? So for your aromatherapist, well, she was anointing the feet of Jesus. And so the bottom of the feet are some of the best ways to intake the oil, into your body. And when you spell spikenard, it is a neurosedative. So what Mary was essentially doing is that, yes, she was doing the honorific act of anointing Jesus's feet, but she was also releasing a fragrance into the room that chilled everybody out.
Uh,
And and so when I talk to Christian audiences, for example, there's about 127 references in the Bible to incense, depending on which translation that you have. But you're able to literally recreate the past in a visceral experience of fragrance by using the things that are mentioned in the Bible or any other wisdom text. If you're Jewish, there is a tradition called Ketore, and there's a prayer called the Pitim HaKatores, where you're actually literally saying the recipe of the incense that was used in the Holy of Holies. And so let's talk a little bit about the evolution of religion and why I'm introducing that now in this at this point in the conversation. So, as the Japanese incense ceremony started to kind of take somewhat hold, and by hold I mean maybe a couple hundred people, right? And it was this idea that Komotos, when they were in Japan for 900 years, they were really only concerned with three things. They were concerned with Buddhism, Taoism, and Shintoism, because then they're just having a conversation, maybe not, about how all this relates. If we look only at Buddhism, Buddhism arrives into Japan around 550 AD. And as I said before, this whole idea of listening to incense is you're listening to Buddha's words. If you are Christian and you're like, I'm not Buddhist, I'm going to stop listening to John. Hang on, don't go away yet. So when you're talking about Jesus, the Greeks and the Romans, they would compare Jesus to a panther. And this whole idea that the sweet breath of the panther, when the panther is in the wild, attracts its prey. And so this whole idea of sharing your enlightenment or sharing the words that make a difference for you become fragrant. And so my teacher said, look, she said, listen, she said, if you're going to be available to all people, you need to be able to speak to all the religions, at least with regards to their incense tradition. So if you're Catholic and you want to have a conversation about frankincense, great. From a Christian standpoint, frankincense represents Jesus as the King of Kings. If you want to talk about Egyptian religions, well, frankincense, for example, was known as sweat of the gods. Because if you look at a tear of frankincense, it looks like you took sweat and you froze it. Okay. And so I could keep going, but the point is this: is that one of the last commitments that we make as komotos is that we make a promise to be available to all people and not reject anyone. And so, thus, the master is available to all people and doesn't reject anyone. This is called embodying the light. What is a good man but a bad man's teacher? What is a bad man but a good man's job? If you don't understand this, you'll get lost, however intelligent you are. It is the great secret. And so, it doesn't mean I suffer you. So like if Paul wants to, come punch me through the computer screen, well, I'm not gonna take that, but I make myself available to you. And so I only had kind of one negative experience at HypnoThoughts, and I want to share this because hopefully that person is listening. So you have to understand what I was wearing the entire weekend, right? I'm wearing a black Samoe, which is, essentially it looks like a black martial arts uniform, and I'm wearing my black belt, right? Well, I mean, I'm doing something very specific, and from time to time, I would go 45 minutes, take a 15-minute break, 45 minutes, take a 15-minute break. And I walked by a group of hypnotists that you could already tell either had been drinking or they were a little bit kind of intoxicated. But this dude was like 6'5", and I'm 6 feet, but still like a lot taller than I am. And as I approached, I watched him. He looked at me. He's like, I'm gonna make fun of this guy. I could totally see it, right? And as I get a little closer, he turns to his friends. He goes, "Hey, look, everybody, it's the Karate Kid." And all I did was smile and look at him and keep walking. But I was thinking in my mind because I had literally just been telling this story about being available to all people. And the way that it started was this. I said, imagine how many times in your life you have been rejected because of what you believe, who you are, maybe how you look, etc. And then think also how many times you've rejected other people because of how they look, what they believe, etc. If you're going to live into an enlightenment, and you don't have to choose this, but this is what we do as komotos. We make a promise to be available to all people because we become like the incense. In other words, if I warm up a fragrance, it's not going to stop a foot before you, Paul, and say, nope, 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 you don't get to have my fragrance. I'm going to go over here to this guy who looks more like me. Wait, what? And so we literally, metaphorically, become incense. We make ourselves available to all people. Now, some people may not want to be in the room, right? But I just thought it was so amazing that I had just been telling the story for like hours, and then I walked by, somebody in my community, somebody like literally, I mean, I've got my name tag on. I'm like, dude, you have no idea who I am, and that's not a flex. I'm just like, man, I'm going to remember this and I'm going to tell the story every time that I can. What are your thoughts on so far? What are your thoughts, Paul?
Well, I think that so this is part of what I was thinking about when I decided I was like, I want to talk with John is our profession, both at the clinical level and on the entertainment side of things, is full of people who do not dedicate themselves to true mastery of of our art or our science, whichever way you want to look at it.
Right,
And I
right.
think that comes out. It doesn't surprise me at all that you told me that story. I'm like, the irony that supposedly people gather at these conferences to learn and grow, which they do, but what they
Yeah.
also do is they're a vacation, right? There's one of the things that's difficult and challenging that I understand about our business is everybody operates in a silo, like everybody's on their own island. And these conferences are a chance for them to get connected to other human beings, that we're all on the same team or we're all part of the same club. And that tends to lead to some of the shenanigans like what you're talking about, right? Is that's their chance to be like, I have a tribe, I have people. But there's a real thing that's bothered me. I've been doing this for 20 years. And one of the things that really does bother me is that there's a, I really think there's a cultural thing of train and 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 train, whether that's literally taking someone's training one-on-one or buying their product online or going to a conference and spending 3 days hopping 1 hour sessions. And a lot of that training, it's not getting them anywhere, right? Like, and this is where I think, like, I come back to the idea that there are so few people that have really devoted themselves to hypnotism the way you've devoted yourself to fragrance. And that's the part that I really find fascinating about you and that I wonder about in myself. I think, when you just back at the beginning, when you told your story, you said 13. 13, I was playing my Nintendo and like I was getting good grades in school and I was a good kid, you know what I mean? But there was nothing in my life that I was ready to devote myself to at 13. And I think that probably a lot of the people that you saw at that conference and at any other conference are probably more like me than more like you. And I'm curious about that. Like, have you ever been able to identify what it is about yourself that made you, as that 13-year-old kid, capable of dedicating yourself to this learning the way that you did?
Yeah, I mean, some of this gets into the woo-woo and some of it doesn't, but it's like, you know, I've always considered myself to be a weird kid. And what I mean by that is WEIRD, and I'm going to make a distinction here in a second between the 16th century spelling of it. So when when I was growing up and I was getting into martial arts, I mean, I'm of the age where I was watching Kung Fu with David Carradine, right? And I was like, dude, I want to be a master. And when I was young, I thought being a master meant being better than everybody. I thought it meant being separate from others, when in actuality, true mastery doesn't seem masterful. And when I got that, it's like you become common and rugged as a stone, but yet people that are into that conversation, they see your light, they see your brilliance. And so, kind of growing up as a weird kid, right, into things that I just was like, it just was stuff I was drawn to. It was that I love telling the story between WEIRD and WYRD, which is this, is that in the 16th century, if you were born into a blacksmith's family in Europe, right? And you're a male, you're expected that you're going to basically become a blacksmith. If you were born into a farming family, you're going to be a farmer. And if you weren't doing that, you were weird. WYRD. And weird means to follow your passions. If you said, I'm father, I'm not going to be a blacksmith, I'm going to become an actor, well,
It makes me think of the Monty Python's movie where the prince keeps going, I don't want to do that. I want to sing. Like, and he'd start to sing, and then the king would cut him off. Stop that! Stop that!
right. Well, and then by definition, then that prince would have been weird,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so here's the thing. It's like, for whatever reason, I've always been committed to growth. And, growth is a wonderful thing, but it is not fun. True growth isn't necessarily fun. I mean, it is to like let me just talk about the hypnotist that called me, Karate Kid, as if a put down, right? Like there's a myriad of ways that I could have reacted to that. But given that literally there's no reason for me to respond except to smile and walk away. Because hopefully he will see this at some point and realize that he would have had an opportunity to connect with another human being at a very, very deep level. But because he chose to make a joke, then I mean, I'm still open to it, but it's like it changes the dynamic. And in other words, there's a reason why that we have two ears and one mouth. And we've heard this before, right? We need to listen more and talk less. I mean, usually, like I usually make the joke where it's like people don't know that I'm a martial artist because I don't walk into the room and go into a stance and be like, I'm a martial artist, right? And if you're only listening to this, what I just did was put myself in a stance and put my fist out on the camera. But the idea here is that true teaching only happens when you ask. And so when I'm giving a lecture or a talk, there's things that I want to say. I personally want to say. And then when I'm done, I'm going to walk away unless somebody asks a question. If you ask a question, this is what my teachers taught me. You can go to a lecture and find great value and benefit from what the lecturer is presenting to you. But until you ask a question, true teaching doesn't happen, because when I ask that question, Paul, the mind opens where I'm waiting for the answer, and then that answer can go in. So relating to my traditional training, about a year into training, my teacher said, true teaching only happens when you ask. You've now been training for a year. I have no obligation to teach you anymore unless you ask me a question. And I was like, whoa, all right. I gotta I
I
gotta work for it. Yeah.
freaking love that.
Yeah. Well, and now when I teach martial arts, I'll do the same thing. I'll teach them basics, and I'm like, great, what questions do you have? And so, because now that I've been a teacher for as long as I have now, different from a student, and I'm always both. I want to be very clear about that. But it's like the questions that my students ask me, and I'm talking mostly martial arts students, is that, that tells me where you are, and then it tells me how to guide you into the next level of where that is. It also makes it much more valuable and beneficial to you personally. So that's why it's like here in America, we have, or even Canada for that matter, is that we have lost this tradition of master student. We've lost this tradition. Sure, it's been replaced a little bit by mentors. This is my mentor, but it's like, if we're not asking questions, and we have this tendency to not do that here because, oh, I don't want that person to think I'm dumb, or I don't know. If anything, the more questions you ask me tells me how intelligent you are, right? And so again, it's this idea that if we're committed to growth in what we're doing, it's it's a very exciting process. And so I apply everything that I do with the same level or practice of mastery. And so, given that my timeline of hypnosis isn't as long as my timeline of fragrance, I'm applying the same principles of mastery to hypnosis. In other words, one definition of mastery is being comfortable in the uncomfortable. If you're not perpetually moving into a state of uncomfortability, then you're really not growing, in my opinion. I mean, I'm sure there's variations and other opinions on that. But one definition of mastery is to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. Back to you, Paul.
One of the things I really want to accomplish with this podcast is to encourage my colleagues to think differently about how we can evolve this art form forward. Well, what if it comes down to things like having your own signature fragrance at your show and leveraging the power of fragrance to get better results, more powerful results, more profound results with your guests on stage and your audience? Worth thinking about? I think it is. The level of learning and the level of depth, which the way you described it to me when we first met, and even listening today, to me, the only word I can think of is profound. And I don't think there are a lot of people who are attaining a profound level of depth as hypnotists, and especially in the entertainment side of things, which again, this podcast really is focused on the entertainment side of hypnotism. You're the first non-stage hypnotist that I've had on this podcast, and I haven't done that many episodes, but when I first started committing to doing this podcast, I really thought I'd never have anyone but a stage hypnotist on here. And again, I think that, but you really spoke to me in your story. And so I'm like, so I just asked you really like three things, and I'll circle back and say, so with what you know about how much learning you did and what it took to attain mastery as a komodo, what would your parallel understanding be of that, of your hypnotism?
I love it. Okay, well, since the majority of your audience, at least right now, are stage hypnotists. So in the Japanese incense ceremony, there's essentially only two schools left. So there were 20 schools originally, and then as time went on, they would either blend together or they would finally end up with the final two. And the final two are the Shino school and the Oi school. And I am trained in both distinctions. So the Shino school is the fire school. It's the school that the samurai were very connected with. And so if you're leading a Shino incense ceremony, my being and my sense is can be very rigid, or it can be more very much codified. Where if I'm doing a ceremony for the OE school is the poetical school, right? It's the school most associated with the aristocracy of Japan. And so it can be a little more flowing and open. And so how I equate this back to being a stage hypnotist is that, you know, comedians know this. Anybody who's ever been with an audience, sometimes audiences can be great and some of them can't be great, but oftentimes it can be associated back to what you're doing. Who are you being in front of the room that makes the difference? So if you're a stage hypnotist, you've got a great deal of stuff already ahead of you. Is my volume right? Is my expression right? Am I standing in the right place? Is my positioning where it needs to be? Am I moving in a way that has the audience want to move with me? Am I connecting in that way? And so I don't see really a difference between the two of that, because we also do that when we're working with our clients one-on-one. Like, not a joke. I had a client an hour before this interview, right? And she's a brand new day one client. And and she's got a walking issue. And so, I mean, I went all the way out to her car. I brought her inside, got her a glass of water. I mean, I went through all these things of the performance of the hypnosis, right? That allowed her, that at the end of her entire time together, she was like, this was really great. thank you so much. I feel the muscles relaxing and where this is. You said that the majority of your audiences are colleges, right? And so you said that there's a great deal of anxiety with college students. So, one of the fun ways to describe enlightenment is to lighten up. So, are you the kind of humorous person that when you're doing your stage hypnosis, that the audience gets transformed by the humor that you brought? Or are they transformed by the mystery that you brought? Obviously one of the connections or one of the appeals of hypnosis is the mystery part, but it also turns people off, right? And so then, we're kind of playing in this world of like I was literally talking with my client an hour and a half ago. She's like, some iteration of, well, am I going to remember all this? Are you going to make me bark like a dog? And I said, no, I do have hypnotists that can do that. Right. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that there's this wide spectrum of things. And so whenever I interact with someone who says, very similar, it's like, oh, well, what do you think of stage hypnotism? And I said, well, just in the same way that if we're talking fast food and fine dining, there's a spectrum of all things. So there's a spectrum of smells, or we see on a spectrum. And I say, I think it's all very important because, you could use, stage hypnosis for a number of things. You could use it to enlighten people. You can use it to make people laugh. You can use it to mystify and wow people. And so I hope you're getting in this response that whatever you want to do you.
Yeah.
Find a way to bring your essence and your joy to move this back to fragrance. Here, I'll give you one of the teachings. So there's smoked incense and there's no smoke incense. There's another way to describe it, but this is devotional and non-devotional. So sorodaki and soneko in the Japanese language. But we could say from a metaphysical standpoint or from an analogy standpoint, it's like we all have our own fragrance, every single one of us, right? For thousands of years, from a chemical and scientific standpoint, I would pick my partner by how they smell. Like I would look and go, you're attractive. And then I would go over and take a smell. I mean, we're really no different than dogs on one level, right? When we are looking for a partner and they smell the way that we want them to smell, we know from a DNA standpoint that we're going to have really great offspring. And that's what that means. I have my fragrance, you have yours. And so when you and I started to talk to get together, we're quite literally warming up in the conversation. And so if we warm up too much, that's like us having an argument and fighting. But when we're warming up and we're at the optimal temperature before the smoke, that's really where we best want to be. But if I start lying to you or I start bringing in, what I call LA finger gunners, people are like, hey, Paul, it's going to be great. We're going to work together. You're going to make lots of money. You stay with me. I'll get you famous in LA. Again, if you're only listening to this, I'm putting my fingers in the air. I'm being an LA finger gunner. And what that means is that there's smoke between us. That smoke is our delusion. The smoke is what separates us. And so we want to find ourselves in a place of complete connection if that's what you're committed to. If a part of your show is to mystify people, I would bring the smoke out and I would, and I would do that. So did that help? Did that?
Yeah. You know, so probably the most common thing in entertainment hypnotism from like a branding and a marketing perspective is, we used to, as a profession, we used to pretty much almost all of us refer to ourselves as stage hypnotists.
Mm.
And what we came to understand after a while was people didn't really know what that meant. They're like, oh, hypnotist on stage? Okay, but what do you do? And you'd have to still explain yourself. And so maybe right around the time I probably got in, around 2004, about 20 years ago, hypnotists started referring to themselves instead as comedy hypnotists.
Mm.
And that happened slowly, but it built and built so that now today, many performing hypnotists refer to themselves as comedy hypnotists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that makes sense to me because then you go, okay, so you're a hypnotist who's funny. An average person will go, okay. But then they still, sort of go, but what do you do? How do you do it? That we're probably never going to get away from that because people just aren't educated enough about what hypnotism is and how it really works. But the comedy hypnotist moniker has helped some.
Right.
Because I work in the college market, comedy has become problematic
Mm.
because again, just where our social issues and political correctness and stuff like that, it's much more likely that if you are comedy focused, you're gonna bother somebody with your comedy at some point. So I never really got into using that term in the first place, but now especially I'm like, I don't want to be a comedy hypnotist. It was never really that important. Like I like to think I'm funny, but I'm funny, it wasn't so important to me to project it like I'm a comedy hypnotist. But
Right.
this fall, I'm debuting a new show, and it's been very purposefully designed to not be a comedy hypnosis show, really at all. And what I've worked on is what I see again in these young people is that they're anxious and they're lonely and they're disconnected. And so I want to do a show that brings them joy. And so
Mm.
I've really, really worked on designing a show that focuses on creating joyful moments throughout that hour and 20 minutes.
Mm.
And it feels like, again, I like thinking of myself as funny. I like when people laugh at my jokes. Like, I like that. But I
Mhm.
feel a lot better in my heart about the idea that I have the opportunity to go out night after night and bring people joy. And so, probably a lot of people, probably almost no one in my side of the profession, in my niche, thinks of it that way, I don't think. And that's okay. I don't mind, but that's what I'm really focused on right now. And so again, this is a great conversation that I've been able to have with you today because I hear you making those references. And if there's a way that I can work fragrance into my show so that it makes people more likely to feel joy, I'll do it. I'll do whatever I can do, to get them there because
Mhm.
I really feel like that's what they need more than ever.
Totally. And totally. And so a couple thoughts. Number one, so as co-multos, we make a promise to do everything we do with great joy. Do with great joy. Because imagine if you did everything in your life with great joy. And I'm talking take the trash out with great joy. I'm talking clean the yard up with great joy. Beyond just the stuff that we think is joyful, it will change your world. And it changed mine. I mean, if I was an ADHD maybe kind of kid, whatever. If I hadn't have discovered incense, I probably would have been on some kind of medication, maybe, right? And so remember that pure incense are psychotropics. They change the quality of our consciousness in the same way that alcohol is also a psychotropic. It's not a psychedelic, it's a psychotropic. Changes the quality of our consciousness. In other words, if you're a drinker, you know that if you drink bourbon, you feel a certain way. If you drink tequila, you feel a certain way. Same thing with incense, is that when you are warming them or burning them, you can do both. You're going to change the quality of your consciousness. And so I would invite you to think about with great joy when you talk about the naming of hypnotists, whether you're a comedy hypnotist or a stage hypnotist, you may know the spiritual philosopher Alan Watts, who passed away in 1973, and Alan Watts called himself a spiritual entertainer. I'm surprised that quote unquote comedy or stage hypnotists haven't called themselves an entertainment hypnotist. Because then when you use the word entertainment, it can really mean everything. I forget this gentleman's name, but I used to spend a lot of time in the comedy clubs because I just loved watching these comedians like share the essence of themselves and kind of move through, pretty quickly. Like I've hung out with Ron White, and that dude is a trip to hang out with. I
Yeah?
mean, trip. John, you know what? A couple nights ago, I was in Dallas. I said, huh? Yeah. Anyway, drove home. I don't know how it happened, but I ended up on the other side of the highway, turned the other way. I was like, I know exactly how it happened, Ron, because I've watched you drink 9 drinks right here, right? But but the idea here is that like if you're calling yourself an entertainment hypnotist, then you can go any direction that you want. But I've seen comedians enlighten an entire room. In many ways, comedians are our last prophets because they're going to move people in a very particular way. So here's the last thought from based on what you just said. It would be very interesting if you had a section of your show or maybe you did one or two of what I would call the master incenses and just, hey, everybody, we're now going to relax, and then just get their feedback about, and then just, give them the experience of the fragrance so that they, could go, whoa, and that's interesting. Also different. People would be like, whoa, I was with this hypnotist and this fragrance was really amazing. And then the next time they smell it, they're going to remember Paul. It's just like the hotel from the earlier in the conversation.
Hey, one last, this is kind of a late question, but it came to me just now and I was like, I'm going to ask it before I let you go. Would you go so far as to say every stage hypnotist ought to be using fragrance on stage?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Yes and no. I mean, I think that everybody should have their own signature fragrance, just in the same way that, now we've got stars of all types that have their own cologne and have their own perfume. Well, again, we know that our sense of smell is our most powerful. So if you want to be like Caesars or the Sahara or any other, Vegas, hotel, it's like take those fragrances and make it your own and always have that available, because then when people smell a very similar fragrance to that, they're going to remember you. It's also a way to control the room. It can be hypnotic.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation with John as much as I enjoyed having it. And if you want to learn more about John and what he does, you should go visit www.sheehan-consultants.com. He's also on social media. He's a great guy and such an amazing resource and offers such a great perspective. Please take advantage of him, reach out to him, and bring him into your world. Thank you, John Launius, for your wisdom and your sharing and your kindness. And thank all of you for listening to this episode of Inside Stage Hypnotism. We'll see you again.